Hi, my name is Lauren Flores, and my presentation today is Propaganda News, Social Media and Information Literacy. And so when we think about our users and their idea of propaganda, generally people tend to think of propaganda as being something like from World War II, or maybe they think of a poster from a totalitarian regime. They may not be aware that propaganda is everywhere. It is in ads, it's in social media, and this is especially concerning because a growing number of people are getting their news from social media sites. And so one of the things that we need to emphasize in our information literacy classes to people is that when they're on social media, they may be interacting with accounts that aren't necessarily either real people or real people with good intentions. And so we do need to alert them to the fact that they're fake accounts. We also need to be sure to teach them propaganda techniques so that way when they're on social media sites that they're able to examine a post and be able to identify possible propaganda techniques that might be used within the post. And so the other thing that we need to emphasize in our classes for our users is that propaganda really works on people's emotions. And what it does is it short circuits your process of thinking, so it's hard for you to critically analyze something if you're upset. Unfortunately, on the internet, there's a long tradition of making people angry in argument on the internet, and so that is something that we really need to educate people about. The other thing that we need to talk about is logical fallacies, because that is another tool for people that are spreading propaganda to bolster their arguments. And so I don't have time to talk about all the different logical fallacies, but it is worthwhile to include that in our information literacy classes and news literacy classes so that way people can tell. We also should talk about the propaganda techniques that Edward Bernays spoke about in his 1928 book, Propaganda. And so his propaganda techniques are 7. There are others that you might see in the literature and in other websites. It really just kind of depends, but I use these as a base. So the 7 techniques that he spoke of are name calling, bandwagon, testimonial, plain folks, card stacking, glittering generalities, transfer, fear, and euphemism. I do want to mention there's some other propaganda techniques that a researcher named Zhdanko spoke about in 2019 in an article about cognitive manipulations on the internet. And I'm not going to go over the list of techniques that she spoke of, but I will talk about 3 of them because I think they're particularly suited to social media sites like Twitter. So one of them is the halo effect, and that is when people use a celebrity to either endorse something or they use their likeness, and it's a way to persuade people because people might find that if a celebrity is endorsing something, it's more credible to them. The other 2 techniques that Zhdanko talks about that I think are really pertinent to Twitter are the presence effect, which is a type of effect where they try to make you feel like you're there and it's very urgent. Also the primacy effect, which is people's tendency to believe the first person or source where they get an information. And so Twitter is being used nowadays as a place for breaking news. And in an article by Gwen Bouvier, she also talks about how journalists in mainstream publications are now using social media as a place to source their stories for mainstream media, which can be kind of concerning because as Mike Abramovitz has spoken about in 2019, a lot of governments find it much easier to put out propaganda on social media instead of taking the effort to try to censor all of the things that they don't want seen. And this is a really important thing because one of the ways that they do this is by using those fake accounts that I spoke of. And so it's really important for us as librarians to teach people how to critically evaluate these social media accounts so that way people can identify them. We also need to be sure to tell people what these types of social media accounts are, what they're called, so sock puppets and bots, and to be able to distinguish between the 2. So sock puppets are false accounts that are controlled by humans, and bots are false accounts that are controlled by automated programs, and they both act a little bit differently. And so it's important for us to share that with our users in our information literacy classes. We also need to share that some of these false accounts will have certain behaviors like sea lioning, which it's a type of harassment technique where a victim is harassed with incessant questions, and they're usually pretty simple and repetitive questions. And it's really meant to make the victim angry, because again, one of the main points of propaganda is to get an emotional response from people. And so we also need to educate our users to avoid trolls in general and be suspicious of them. We also need to really emphasize that they need to not feed the trolls. So in other words, that means not to engage with them. So when they are on social media, to just leave annoying people and trolls alone. We also need to be sure to teach our users how to identify those propaganda techniques. So definitely Brené's list and other lists as well that we find in the literature. And we also need to emphasize to them that when they go to certain social media sites like Facebook, they're actually going to a site that's curated for them. So for instance, Facebook tends to have ads based on your searching behavior, and people need to be aware of that because it will affect what they're seeing on social media and how they get their news. So the other thing that we need to do is we need to teach better methods for evaluating information on social media. So instead of the CRAP test, we need to use SIFT instead, which is much simpler and more suited to the information landscape. And above all, we really need to tell people to check their emotions, to think before they share posts, and to critically evaluate what they're seeing in social media.